crisis affect the direct relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War in the 1960s specifically, especially when it came to sort of the political tensions between the two countries and as well as the nuclear arms race. And I found that the crisis played honestly a pretty major role in temporarily lessening the political tensions between the Soviets and the Americans. However, the crisis did eventually launch a new nuclear arms race, despite a lot of treaties that were passed afterwards that were supposed to prevent that. And yes, I'm doing my full paper instead of doing just the part of it. So this is part one of, I guess, 3. So when it comes to American relationships, I guess before the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's two parts to that. There's Cuba and the Soviet Union. For Cuba, that's based around the Kennedy administration and the American government basically not liking the fact that we had a communist country about 90 miles from our coastline. And so we participated in essentially just state-sponsored terrorism against Cuba. And then in 1961, we tried to actually invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which we tried to invade Cuba and get rid of Fidel Castro, their communist leader. That did not work, as he sort of, I guess, lost the element of surprise. And he just honestly left after that. We just lost the element of surprise. Let's see how that went. This was honestly an international embarrassment, as Kennedy at that point was thought of as indecisive and just not very well at all for decision-making in crisis situations. Eventually, we did come up with another plan to invade Cuba and get rid of Castro, called Operation Mongoose, but this didn't happen because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the Soviet side of things, that's based around the election of 1960, in which the platform that Kennedy, eventual President John F. Kennedy, would be running on, was something called the missile gap, in which Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union at the time, was boasting to the rest of the world that the Soviet Union was building nuclear warheads like sausages, as he put it. This is completely false, as the U.S. had a very considerable advantage in nuclear warheads, but they're boasting that, and we believed it. And so, that came to that. And we were also in the middle of the Cold War and the arms race at the same time. Then in 1961, we tried to, I guess, slow this down and maybe prevent this by putting Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey, which you could say, which some historians do argue, started this whole crisis situation off. Yeah, you can see the top 2 images are from the Bay of Pigs invasion. Bottom left is from Operation Mongoose, the plan to invade Cuba and get rid of Castro in October of 1962. The bottom right is one of the Jupiter missiles that we put in Italy and Turkey. Now, the actual missiles in Cuba came from the Soviet Politburo, who met with Nikita Khrushchev, again, the Soviet leader, and convinced him of this because, one, they wanted to counter the U.S.'s growing lead in missile numbers, which, no matter how much they boasted to the rest of the world that they were ahead, they just simply weren't. 2, Khrushchev really, really wanted West Berlin. Like, he wanted it very badly because he wanted, I guess, another presence in the Western world, sort of, I guess, spy, as he put it. 3, both Cuba and the Soviet Union were aware that America wanted to increase its presence in Cuba, and they wanted to very, very much stop that from happening. And so, missiles were placed in secret in August of 1962, and Kennedy would find out basically 2 months later on October 16th, which most historians agree starts this whole crisis off. Or to the actual crisis now. The actual missile sites were discovered by a U-2 spy plane, which which took photos, and you can see here at launch sites 2 days before Kennedy was alerted. And the CIA interpreted missiles. I don't know if you guys can see the sites that they're pointing at over there. It's kind of blurry, especially over here as well. Kennedy learns of this and creates what would be known as the executive committee to figure out, okay, what are we going to do about this? We can't just let this happen. They come up with a couple options, you can see. One, they can just do nothing, let it happen. Two, they can use diplomatic pressure against the Soviet Union to remove them. Three, they can do what they, I guess, were planning to do the entire time and just simply invade, take the missiles, take out Castro as they originally wanted to do. Four, they can do what called the U.S. Air Force, have to do an airstrike, fix the missile sites, and take care of it that way. Or five, which is the one they eventually went with, a blockade by the U.S. Navy around the island of Cuba. Originally, though, just about everybody in the committee but Kennedy wanted both an invasion and airstrike, but Kennedy said, absolutely not, we're not doing that. I am not going to go to war over this. And the blockade was agreed upon. The crisis continues for, I guess, about a week and a half after this, and tension just keeps building and building. There are threats on either side. American actions are seen as tyrannical by most of Eastern Europe and Asia, basically allies of the Soviet Union, considering they put missiles in Italy and Turkey first, and their point of view was that they were just responding to what we did first, and so we're seen as like tyrannical in that way. Eventually, Kennedy gets the executive committee over again, and he, like I said, agrees to an invasion, but in a reversal of roles this time, he gets talked out of it instead of them agreeing with him. However, he does institute a crash program, as I guess he calls it, to institute a new government of Cuba if an invasion goes ahead. However, again, that doesn't happen, as the crisis is averted and an agreement is reached. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Italy and Turkey that they had installed there, and the Soviets removes their missiles from Cuba. Now, I want you all to know that the U.S. portion of this is not known by the public. So the public only knows that the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. So as far as they know, that's it. That's all that happens. The U.S. portion of this agreement was not widely understood, or known, I guess, in like the newspaper, for example. And so everybody that aligns with America is like hailing Kennedy as a hero. You know, they beat the communists, they did it. While everyone in the East, including in China, Cuba, all of the allies of the Soviet Union is like, Khrushchev, what did you do? Why would you go to the Americans on this? Why have you done this? You betrayed us, that sort of thing. And that was essentially the end of the actual crisis, no matter how much we came into the war. In the aftermath, when it comes to the Cuban-Soviet relationship that they had beforehand, Castro and the Cuban government are completely livid at this. None of their concerns were addressed before, during, or after. They were not talked to any of this. And you can essentially think of it as Cuba being a pawn in a game of chess that the Americans and the Soviets were playing. They made it clear also, the Cuban government made it clear that if the missiles would have been under their control, they would have fired them off. But they were not, as they were under Soviet control, and the Soviets would blatantly not let them do that. Their relationship was marred and basically split apart when Cuba sided with China in the whole China-Soviet Union ideological split, in which China was more towards Maoism and Cuba was more towards communism, which is splitting apart between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. On the American side, the American-Soviet side of things, it went much better temporarily. Both sides basically realized how close they came to nuclear war, and then they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which banned all testing of nuclear weapons except for underground, or except for underground. So not in the air, not in space, and not underwater. They installed the Moscow-Washington hotline as well, which people think it's a telephone. It's not a telephone. It originally was a teletype machine, as you can see there. Both sides, shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, announced a nuclear cutback in which they were going to cut back on both nuclear material making and nuclear bomb making, essentially. But both parties kind of discontinued this in 1964. Then, 4 years later, both parties signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1968. Now, critics and most historians are kind of divided on this because the treaty involved two things. One, it involved in its surroundings. It involved two things. So one was disarmament, which again didn't work too well because the countries that had nuclear arsenals at the time continued to build them up, which was the Americans, the Soviets, the French, the Chinese at the time. And two, it wanted to keep countries that didn't have nuclear weapons from getting nuclear weapons, which kind of worked, but not really. Really, some countries eventually managed to get it through their allies, again, like us, the Americans and the Soviets, giving our allies weapons. But on the political side of things, we had detente until the late 70s, so that ended. So politically, yes, the tensions increased, but when it comes to the nuclear arms race, it only increased it, to be quite honest with you. And then, on the actual Soviet side of things by themselves, like I said earlier, the compromise really just embarrasses Khrushchev, because the Soviets were basically seen as retreating from circumstances that they themselves had started. It really was an international embarrassment to them. It got so bad to the point that the Soviet Politburo tried to essentially form a coup to arrest Khrushchev and eventually execute him. But Khrushchev learned of this and resigned before they could arrest him and execute him in 1964. And so, I guess really overall, the Cuban Missile Crisis is just about honestly the closest we've come to nuclear war in our lifetime. And politically, yes, it decreased tensions between us and the Americans and the Soviets temporarily, that is, anyways. But when it comes to the nuclear arms race, they tried to decrease tensions on that end, but it only, I guess,